I'm Mark Sefter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome
to Arcane Mark.
to GM Tools, Backgrounds, and Lore. So, on today's episode, we are talking about characters' backgrounds and backstories, which in games like Pathfinder 2e or D&D 5e have a mechanical concept called a background that you actually pick.
Mm-hmm.
In some games, they're kind of more in the literally background.
Yes. And then lore is in the sort of Pathfinder 2e sense, although there's plenty of skills like this in other games of that very specific and narrow skill that represents something about your character's unique training and experience, and well, is usually tied to a background of some kind.
It represents niche knowledge, which you either gain from literally taking a lore skill in Pathfinder 2e, or in some RPGs, maybe the GM just gives it to you without you taking a specific skill, or it's one of those things you have to write in on the character sheet, or something like that. That's not covered by one of the broad topics of knowledge that is usually taken in that RPG. So in Pathfinder, this is very clear cut because backgrounds give you a lore skill, and lore skills are things like alcohol lore or other things like that might be more niche than other knowledge skills that you might have wanted to take, like Arcana or Nature.
Yeah. But by virtue of being more niche, they let you get into deeper questions on that subtopic. I know one of the things that you see a lot with lore type skills, whether they're in Pathfinder 2nd edition or not, is the idea of, like, you know, players proposing lores that are just giant and can eat up an entire skill or even multiple skills under the base set. They should generally be much smaller and more specific. Like the Pathfinder 2e core has some guidelines for them where it'd be like, oh yeah, you know, it would be like lore about like a specific city, but not like lore about an entire continent or what have you.
Or even an entire country. Usually.
Or an entire country, yeah. But then like you might see sometimes it suggested that like, oh, you could have a lore about like an entire plane of existence if it doesn't come up that much. So generally, like, that was thinking about that was actually what had me thinking about this episode in the first place, is that a lot of what is appropriate for the scope of those kinds of skills is kind of like, how often is it going to come up and how deep do you really want to go with it?
If your campaign is set on the Plane of Fire, you should not allow Plane of Fire lore, even though there are things in the game that literally give you Plane of Fire lore, because that is just lore of everything. If your campaign is like, we're entirely in the Plane of Fire, and Plane of Fire lore would let me know about everything in the Plane of Fire, then it's just like, yeah, that probably doesn't work for you. Whereas, possibly material plane lore may be relevant or useful, or at the very least, something like if you're set in the Plane of Fire, but you're playing in like the Alucard or Golarion setting, and you're like lore Golarion, so you know that there's this planet where Ravagug is at, that matters cosmologically because Ravagug could get out and eat everything. And it's like, yeah, okay, I have Golarion lore.
Yeah, but like, you wouldn't have Golarion lore in a setting where people would be like, yes, we care about the politics in this specific small town in Andoran, and that's what we're rolling about.
If you're playing like Hell's Rebels, you wouldn't allow Golarion lore. Be like, well, I should know about all of these countries because they're on Golarion, and I was at Golarion lore.
It should be, lore type skills should be something that is going to come up in sessions, but not like every single session all the time. Not as frequent as those other sort of skills. But in terms of having them come up, it's useful to think about as a GM, you know, sometimes there are existing challenges and adventures that you can say, oh yeah, you know, this skill makes sense as an alternate way to approach it, whether the player proposes that directly or not. And then also, if you notice, hey, this isn't really coming up, adding more opportunities for it to do something. And it doesn't have to be like, this is the skill that completely solves the riddle, but like, maybe the player with architecture lore is able to find that something is off with the building that gives them a hint about a secret door, or like, that tells them more about the history of the place that helps them uncover something new.
That's right.
In a different way.
And so, in much the same way that lores make sense based on the scope of your campaign, so like Golarion lore in Starfighter would be very legit because it's like, hey, it's gone in the gap. What's going on? I don't know. What I do know is I have Golarion lore, right? What as Linda was saying, it's important to consider the way that characters' backgrounds can tie into the story. And one way you can do that is to literally seed moments where the character's background knowledge would be helpful to the story. And you can do that whether or not there's a lore skill involved, or it's in 5e where there's like a special background ability that's connected to your background, or it's just a background that they wrote up for an RPG that doesn't have background mechanics at all. You can include things that you know are attached to the character's background, especially the case if you have pre-generated characters or pre-generated backgrounds for an adventure that you made where you're like, here's some suggested backgrounds. You should always make sure that you tie in ways that those backgrounds could matter. For example, in the Jewel of the Indigo Isles adventure path, which Linda wrote the third book of that, there are just sections where each of the backgrounds, like one of the backgrounds is a chef, and so there's times where it's like, oh yeah, if you have this background, then you would just automatically know. Because it's not just any chef. You trained at one particular school. And so, like, when they're asking, like, who's in charge of that school, they're like, the difficulty to know who's in charge of that school is this. Or you just know
it. Because, yeah.
You just know it if you have this background because you literally just studied with them at that school just before the campaign.
So those, both the backgrounds and those kind of niche skills give you a way to have characters have specific knowledge that is theirs, that wouldn't be something that another character would have, which can be interesting if you have, like, let's say you have the super smart alchemist who has all these different skills and is usually the one who's better at arcana or whatever, but then if it's has to do with this one specific type of magic that the this one specific type of, like, historical magic that the fighter, like, grew up studying or whatever, and the fighter might know more about that. So it helps to bring people into the story and have them be the specialist, and to give a reason why they know more. Because in some ways, the simplification of skills where it's like, oh yes, we have a skill called society, and that represents knowing, like, such a massive amount of stuff. And sure, as a GM, you can say, okay, well, for the DC is going to be easier for things that are closer to your lived experience and to where you studied and that kind of thing.
You have the Streetwise or the Courtly Graces feat, and therefore, your DC is easier for you on certain things.
But still, there's only so much you can do that. So these give you another way to come at thing and saying, like, sure, the generic society skill is going to be a DC 30 to know about this because it's pretty obscure, but to know about something that happened in this random small town in Andoran. But if you have that small town in Andoran lore, then it's like a DC 10 or 15 maybe, even if it's just like, oh yeah, of course the mayor of this small town in Andoran, or maybe you just know it outright because if
you have a background that said that you were from that town where you had to vote in mayoral elections, then, some people don't know the name of their mayor, even though they voted in mayoral elections, but it should be at least pretty easy, especially if it's a really small town.
And I think, too, with lores, it's a lot easier to, like, and this is a toggle that we played with in in Pathfinder Society in the past before we were like, things are a little more complicated than they need to be, but there's something that you can more easily give out is, like, here, have a bonus lore type thing without disrupting the balance of the game too much.
It can be a story award to indicate that somebody knows about a certain thing because it happened in the story.
Because they become an expert of a particular thing.
I gave it out as one of the rewards in the Academia subsystem that I wrote for Strength of Thousands. One of the things it gives you is more lores. There's a lot of things that
because there's so many of them, you're not gonna, like, bloat out the skill system.
Right. So, you can always think of lore and information as a reward to give to players and their characters, and as a way to hook in information or clues that you want to give out. Because almost any game you're in has at least some rule that says, like, if it's literally in the character's backstory that they know this, then they don't need to roll because they already knew this because it was in their backstory. Like, if someone reads a setting book that says such and such a person is a famous person who a teacher of pirate fencing techniques, and they decide to make a pirate fencer, and they said they studied for 10 years under that person.
Yeah, they don't have
then they
to
don't
roll
need
a
to
check.
roll a check to know the
They
name of
know
that
that,
person,
yes.
even though that person is fairly obscure and is not well known by the general populace as a pirate fencing instructor, because what kind of technique is pirate fencing? They particularly would know it. And so this actually you don't even have to think of it as a way to reward the players, which it is a way to reward them for engaging it.
For coming with the backstory.
You don't even have to think of it as a way to make them feel better, even though it is a way to make them feel better. It can be a way for you to ensure that you get information that you want or need for your adventure to make its way to the group. In a similar way
making
systems...
a link to the character's backstory in the thing that you're doing. It's like, yes, you know this automatically because it's in your backstory.
That's
it's in
right.
your history.
Like, there are some systems, like the Gumshoe system, which Trail of Cthulhu is based on the idea that if you have a skill at all, then the GM reads the list of all the skills people has, only makes there be things that you can do based on the skills that they have, and if you have the skill, you automatically succeed at getting it. It's how you make sure that people don't lose clues in that system that are necessary to solve the mystery. And you don't have, obviously in most systems, you're not going to go that far. You're still going to have checks. There's still going to be uncertainty about whether they figure everything out. But you can give some crucial information automatically by tying it into a background or backstory in a way that it makes sense in the narrative and the fiction that just that character definitely knows this as like a backstop thing where it's like, oh wow, they literally have rolled natural ones on everything this entire session, but I need to throw them something because they're going off 8 different red herrings from those critical failures. So, this character has for their backstory reasons, they would definitely know this.
Yeah.
I'm not going to even have to roll their lore skill where they might roll natural 1 again.
Yeah.
Because it's not just part of their lore, it's just literally from their backstory.
Yeah, maybe they at least know a contact that they can talk to give them more information or something like that.
Exactly.
So one of the things that, it's in the sort of the name lore and what we've been talking about so far is kind of an implicit assumption that these highly specialized skills are based on what you know.
Yes.
So do you have any thoughts on, like, why are they usually about knowledge instead of, like, performing a specific activity?
So they're usually about what you know simply because of the fact that information is a place where the gap between players, GM, and characters exists in the sort of triangle of knowledge, where in some cases there is information that the characters have that is actually maybe even more than what the GM really has, and the GM actually has to take processing time to figure out that information the character has if the player asks for it. The GM has information that neither the characters nor the players have. The characters have some that neither of the two has until the GM spends time to generate it. And the players usually don't always have some information that neither of the other two have, but they clearly, or at least that's relevant to the situation, they clearly have information that their characters don't have. That's metagame information. They may not have any directly relevant information the GM doesn't have, but maybe they do because they have their own experiences and are more experienced than the GM in certain ways, or they know about how something works in real life, or something else like that. And because of that triangle of knowledge that is possessed only by one of those 3 entities, it means that these kind of situations show up for knowledge more than for anything else because they need to be filled in. And it's not just what you know in terms of, like, I read it in a book. It can be based on instincts. It can be based on looking around in an area and what you see and sense can be somewhat predicated on your background. Like, if you smell something and it's like, this is the smell of like moonshine. Some characters might just like be like, yeah, I definitely know what that's gonna smell like because of the fact that my background is moonshiner, and it said that for 20 years I've been moonshining, and that's the only thing I've done. And if you did, at that point, it would be like a disgrace if you didn't know what moonshine was from smelling it. So it's not even necessarily just based on reading a book. It could be based on facts or clues or information you're able to obtain based on an observation that other people might not. Other people might be like, this is a very, like, it's a very sharp smell that smells like some kind of alcohol or ether.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is what the investigator might say. And your moonshiner is like, it's moonshine.
Yep. I just know it. One of the other things I was thinking about, too, is that, for that one, is that the more that... It's easier to say, like, oh, you know more about this specific thing than to write out, like, another complex power that's going to be bespoke to the particular background. So, like, in Pathfinder, you can get skill feats in your backgrounds, but those aren't, like, unique to the backgrounds. Whereas, like, themes in Starfinder have, like, their own powers to them that are unique to those. But then if you look at, like, you know, how many backgrounds do you have in Pathfinder versus themes in Starfinder, the chunkier you make that rules element, the less space you have to
and 5e
to flesh it out.
5e also has things like the themes, although the 5.5/remaster/2024 is probably gonna, seems like they're gonna remove that and just put feats in instead. But the other problem with the way that themes and original 5e works that are not a problem with the way that PF2 and the 5e update work is that if you put something in the theme or the 5e background, and let's say pilot is a common favorite theme, like the ace pilot for Starfinder. If someone wants to be the pilot of your ship, but their background isn't an ace pilot, or their theme is something else, like they want to be a pilot who is constantly like on holovids, like being a pilot to show off and become a celebrity. The problem is that now there are, like, at higher levels, 4 features about being a pilot that they not only don't have, but can never gain in any way. It's impossible. And if those are either features that aren't very good, in which case, why do we do it? Or that will mean that you're significantly bad at being a pilot compared to the person who took the stereotypical ace pilot instead of tried to do the creative, I'm a holovid pilot.
And it may be the case then that the more that is required in a constructed background, the less likely it is to fit exactly with your character. And if those differences are more narrative in nature, it's easier to work with the GM and for the GM and the player to work together and be like, okay, yeah, you know, the explanation for why I got this is different. But then, like, if you have these, like, specific and complex mechanical functions that are bolted onto it, and then you have to, like, try to justify those, then it's trickier, and you may find yourself needing to do something where it's like, well, you know, I'm gonna take this theme, but I'm gonna swap out the 6th level ability for the 6th level ability from this other theme because that's better fitting for my version here.
Yes. And so that's why things like information or clues you can pick up or things that are related to your experience and past rather than to what you can do, like, right now, what tasks you can perform, work better for distinguishing backgrounds.
And then, so, like, you know, Pathfinder has that it gives you a skill feat, but you could get that skill feat elsewise, so it's not the only way to get it. It's just like, here's the way that you do it. Like,
imagine, just to show the more extreme example of why it's not great to have something that's in the background that is, like, crucial and that you can't find anywhere else, or maybe not crucial, but, you know, like, makes you move in a certain direction. Imagine if you had a setting where it's like, okay, only, like, 5% of people are, or less, fewer, are gifted with magic as sorcerers. And if they are, then there's, like, a tool that can determine that they are, and then they go to sorcerer school. And so you would be like, okay, in this setting, if you want to be a sorcerer, you must take the sorcerer student background, because it says in there, you are a sorcerer, you can use sorcerer spells. Like, this is actually pretty bad.
Yeah.
Because it makes it so that you can't express various other backgrounds with your sorcerer. And obviously, cutting into classes is an even more extreme example than the ace pilot, but it shows how you can go farther and farther into problems the more and more mechanical things that you hang on directly on the character's background in terms of what they're even allowed to try to do.
Yeah, so generally if the background's more about you are someone who has had these particular experiences, and that's one thing that that I like about the way that a lot of the Paizo backgrounds and themes and things like that are written is they won't be like, this is your exact story, but it'll be like you know, you were a mercenary. Maybe you came to this life because of money or fame, or maybe you were looking for just a place to belong, or things like that, to try to inspire coming to things from different directions.
Yep, absolutely.
The ones that you get for something like an adventure path are a lot more specific, because they'll be like, yes, well, you were studying with this particular person and you knew this person. But I think that those are valuable because in that case, it's not random what that connection is. The adventure has it built in that there's a reason for you to have a connection to a specific person or to know a specific thing. And that gets into sort of the knowledge bits that you would have again. So those backgrounds are not going to be like, you know, you studied here and you felt this way about it. That's another thing you'll notice, like, one of the tips for writing for publication in RPGs is don't assume what the PCs will do, think, or feel. Just present what is the situation, and then they can.
PCs will be horrified by this.
Yes.
And they will obviously arrest this miscreant at once.
Yeah, the word "if" gets used so much. You're like, if the PCs do this, if they do this instead, then yada yada yada. Just, you don't know what they're gonna do. But the more that they can be like, you had this experience, and not say, and this is how it affected you, the better. Exactly. When you're constructing new backgrounds. You
give them the idea of the experience, and then they decide how that affects them. Mm-hmm. It's a back and forth. A good background is a back and forth rather than just being one-sided, either from the GM or the story, which, like Linda said, tells you how to feel. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. From that direction. The other kind of not great backstory is the one that is one-sided on the player's side, where they just wrote out 10 pages of backstory.
And it might not fit.
It's not tied to your world at all. None of the proper downs that are in it like have been vetted or like talked back and forth with the GM, and like maybe it doesn't jar, like maybe it's not contradictory, but it wasn't something that you were planning to use in the adventure. And,
so then you gotta like try to find a way to shoehorn it in, or worse, like they're like, yes, you know, I am an up and coming person who has lots of contacts in this criminal enterprise, and you're like, that criminal enterprise is by a planned villain organization. Now, you could do something awesome with that, but you're really, like, you don't want to get blindsided with that stuff. You want it to be a conversation. So you can, you know, that has lots of great ways that things can fit in, but also, like, you have to really be thinking about, is the player going to want to have their former contacts betray them, and all that kind of stuff.
It depends on the player.
It really does. You gotta know your players.
Yeah, like...
Insert obligatory session 0 tangent here.
Yep. Sometimes you might just decide to have the Alchemist players' pen pal group be a shadowy organization that are like the penultimate BBG villain group in the
and
AP.
That worked really great for you and for that player, and was hilarious for everyone at the table when we suddenly discovered him inside the villain's lair. But like, what are you doing here?
He said to you guys, what are you guys doing here?
And we're like, we asked you that question. Why are you here?
It was perfect because he was missing the week before that when they infiltrated the lair. So I was just like, he's gone. And he knew in advance he wasn't going to be there, so I roleplay with him, them being like, you're going to be inducted to a full member because of your great job in this organization, so you need to come to the main base, and we're going to set you up with your own lab.
And the players, and of course we're all like, you know, metagame players or whatever, like, yeah, okay, the player's not here this session, so of course his character's not here. And then we're like, oh my god.
Well, and he just said he was busy.
Yeah.
And he had something to do. And they were like, oh yeah, well the player's not here, so of course he's not going to say he has something to do. We ended the session with them running into him, and I was like, you look up and you see Niv, which is the name of the player. And they didn't know that because I had been secretly telling the player all this stuff.
Oh my god.
And then when they started the next session, I told them, hey, so remember you went to the lab and you have this new lab, and So suddenly, where we're starting your session is you're in the lab and like the door busts down after an alarm goes off and you have to go to like into red alert, and then the door busts down and all the rest of the group is there. So then the player was there and he was like, "What are you guys doing here?"
That was great.
Yep. So you can sometimes have the backgrounds really sing if you have a back and forth between and trust between the GM and the player.
But if he had just done that and you hadn't been able to link that in because you didn't know that was what he was going for, and then the organization popped up later or whatever, that would have been an issue.
Yeah, he just said that he wanted to be part of the group that was trying to find exploits in the reality of the universe. Because we were doing a playtest for PF2.
There was some seriously pro backstory knitting in that campaign.
Well, thank you, Linda.
You're welcome. All right. So in terms of lore and background,
I think that we covered all the main points I wanted to cover about enriching your campaign by making sure to include the characters' backgrounds. So even if it's not a pre-published adventure with pre-published backgrounds, still remember, just think about in each session, is there a place where the character's background could be relevant?
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's like alcohol lore, maybe it could.
Yeah.
You could think of something. And they're going to feel so good when their weird, obscure lore that only came from their background actually is an important skill that they can use, even if it's not like that important of a skill. If you ask for like a weirdly specific skill that you know that someone has, it's
like, oh, I have that skill.
Like if someone had taper lore, and you're like, does anyone have taper lore? Or you could say, this is a nature check, although a taper lore would be much easier.
It's like,
I have taper lore!
It's so exciting when those
It's really exciting when that happens. So
yeah.
That my main TLDR of this is, players love it if you do this to blatantly kind of connect their background into it. It makes their characters feel like they're connected and part of a living, breathing world. And so even if you're playing a system that's not Pathfinder 2e, that doesn't have the lore skill, you can still do this.
You can still give them that kind of knowledge. And you can still, provide that either being like, that, or, if your players are the type to love diving into resources, giving them something that they, there's pre-published stuff that you can be like, hey, you know the things from these pages of this particular book. So you can check that out if there is someone who likes to do their research into. So the other more broader meaning of lore, of the campaign's lore and the sections of that are relevant to them.
Absolutely.
Because it's cool when players will be like, oh, yeah, I've decided that I'm from this place. And then they want to read, like, a few pages to learn, like, oh, this place is about this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think that covered most of what I wanted to say in a quickie topic today.
Yep. It was a pretty straightforward one, but I thought that it would be cool to talk about lore, skills, and their ties to character backgrounds.
Awesome.
Specialized knowledge.
So,
all right,
let's
thanks,
say goodbye
everybody.
to YouTube and then do our outro. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.